Teenager 19. What was a panty raid anyway, I wondered, as I sniffed the spring breeze, May 4th, 1970, Burlington, Vermont, waiting for my roommate to douse himself in Brut and Banaka. Would we gather our cotton underwear and hands that had known no harvest, parade across campus, waving them like flags or clouds or dreams drifting toward our future? Or was it their panties we were after, to snatch from clotheslines, tumbling dryers, open drawers, or that barely imaginable triangle where radars jammed and things went wildly off course? The stiff wind held far-off towns and clouds gunmetal gray as dusk closed over. When finally we were revved, bursting, flashlights powering holes in the night sky, ready to divvy up whatever loot we'd find, when in short, we were strapped in, ready for the long ride to manhood or wherever we thought we were going, the leaders relayed the change in plans, the radio news, that monks had wrapped themselves in robes of flame, and soldiers wrapped in body bags were flying home. And now this rumor grown to legend, and legend to life, until we all tasted metal in our mouths and something else, hot and desperate and large, undeniably among us that was not us alone. And 4 names were on our tongues, 4 names as we marched away from our teens and toward that strange country called 20. And as for me, a 5th name was on the wind that night, a name marching toward me across the college green, a vigil candle cupped in her small hands. And whether I got in her panties that night, I cannot say, for the wind was up and the rain came down, and we cupped our candles for all we were worth, trying to keep that guttering flame going as long as we could for the 4 dead in Ohio. So, unlike the other poem, Wheeze, which is lyric and metaphorical in style, Teenager 19 is straightforwardly narrative and often literal in its imagery. The poem is long-lined free verse, alternating between 10 and 12 syllables in the beginning, going to 14 to 16 syllables later on. It's very long-lined, unrolling the story, unlike Wheeze, which is very chiseled. The poem opens with clear narrative efficiency, noting the time and historical moment, May 4th, 1970, place, Burlington, Vermont, situation, panty raid at UVM. It has all the earmarks of a story, and its initial contract with the reader seems to promise an accessible, amusing, lighthearted tale. But I hope part of the success of this poem resides in its sudden and yet well-prepared shift in tone and focus, from the comic to the tragic, from the personal to the political, the results of which deliver a lesson to the protagonist in terms of the relative value of what's important in life. As noted above, the poem is mostly literal in its description, but a few pieces of detail in the first half of the poem are well coiled, and I hope spring open in the second half of the poem. For instance, the roommate who douses himself in Brut and Banaka anticipates the monks who wrap themselves in robes of flame. And the boys' cotton underwear that they wave like flags or clouds or dreams drifting toward their future gains resonance in the poem's second half with the soldiers wrapped in body bags. And finally, the sexual radars that cause things to jam and go wildly off course under the clouds' gunmetal gray anticipates the deaths from the Vietnam War and the Kent State killings in the poem's second half. Undergirding it all is the question, what is it to achieve manhood and to mature into an adult world that contains both sex and death? In the midst of this rather straightforward narrative, there are meaningful pockets of resistance, if not outright concealment, the most obvious being near poem's end when the narrator says, "Whether I got in her panties that night, I cannot say." In the antic hormonal mood of the poem's first half, the narrator's sexual desires and exploits take center stage, and readers might expect the climax of the plot to reveal his personal success with a panty raid. But of course, the plot has been altered by the events of the poem's second half, and now it is almost irrelevant to know how the narrator's personal conquest turned out. Its importance pales in the face of the larger historical moment they've suddenly found themselves in. So the poet, if I can remember back at all to the decisions I made in 2005 or so, a decade ago, the poet chooses to conceal this information. Notice, that's concealment in a poem that otherwise favors overt disclosure. I should also note that there is quite a bit of metaphoric language in this poem, especially after the literal narrative beginning and the literal narrative end, in which details are rather straightforward. So I guess the province of the analogical, the metaphor, is not only reserved for poems of concealment, but the nature of these metaphors in Teenager 19 does favor revelation rather than concealment. They set up the second half of the poem. As I've already suggested, the metaphors of sex as jamming radars, or underwear as flags, or clouds that are gunmetal gray, or even the trope of teenage boys being strapped in, ready for the long ride to manhood and ready to power holes in the night sky, all work to help the reader anticipate the sudden shift to the Vietnam War and the Kent State killings in the poem's second half.